Hello everybody. Welcome to this session, Our Political Party's Over. My name's Niall Crowley. I'm one of the founders of Invoke Democracy Now, a democracy organisation that was set up after the referendum result in June 23rd. Just very briefly, I'm going to introduce the speakers and I'll have 5 minutes to speak and then we'll get the discussion going. First off is Miranda Green, who's a journalist and former Liberal Democrat advisor, specialising in politics and education. And then we've got Emily Barley on my right, who's the chairman of Conservatives for Liberty. And then on my left, we've got Jhanelle White, who's a student and political activist, former member of the Dudley Youth Council and founder and chair of Political Sweep. Douglas Carswell, who was due to speak, has rung in sick. He hasn't been into a fight or anything like that, but he can't make it. So we've got a wonderful substitute in James Delingpole on my right as well. And finally, Dr. Mike Fitzpatrick, who is on my left just here, who's a writer on medicine and politics and the author of The Tyranny of Health. So, Miranda, would you like to start us off?
We're supposed to be discussing whether the political party is over, and I would say that it's not yet a corpse, but it's in a lot of trouble, quite sick. And I wanted to sort of focus on, very briefly, on what's gone wrong, but there may be some ideas for how we could sort of reinvent democracy in an era where the political parties feel very, very retro indeed, and as if they're behind the curve of what the appetite amongst the public craves. We sort of offered two things, neither of which I think are ideal. One is a kind of bloodless technocracy, which sort of sells itself as very sensible and competent and managerial, but doesn't really speak to people's real thirsts. And on the other side, as we know, a kind of massively successful at the moment wave of populism, some of which is quite nationalistic in its tone. I would argue, being of a essentially small L liberal point of view, that neither of these things are the answer. And we need to sort of move beyond them and try and invent something new. Partly also because of what's just happening, which is that over a long period of time, several decades, the traditional voting patterns in this country are sort of breaking down. So the days of the 1950s and 60s where 90% of the electorate would either be voting red or blue, that's over now. And if there is a kind of fracturing underway, particularly amongst younger voting groups, which is clearly evidenced by the pollsters, we need to think about what to put in its place in a constructive way. And so here are just three short ideas of constructive ways that we could think about what comes next. One is participation. So clearly, there are these sort of interesting new movements like Momentum and like the extraordinary mass membership of the Scottish National Party since the referendum in 2014. So there are sort of cases of rushing to participate in something. So there's clearly sort of appetite there, but it's not the same as participation in the decision-making process of the country. So I think it's I feel quite cheered in a way by Momentum and by the kind of rush of young people particularly joining, even when I don't remotely agree with the politics that's being sort of espoused and retailed by those particular groups, because I think involvement is a good thing, but it isn't the same. It's participating in the decision making. So we have to invent new ways, and I think we should be a bit more experimental. I think we should go beyond elections, and we should look at the sort of experiments that have been done in the Netherlands and in Ireland, where you actually have citizens' juries. You try to consult the public at every stage of policy making, not just in a yes-no vote and not just in choosing representatives. The second thing that I think is really, really important, it's very important to me personally, and my sort of political outlook, but the idea of pluralism and pluralism as an ideal. First past the post is kind of probably eventually breaking down, I think, as voting patterns fracture and as you have more choice. But those choices are not really possible once you come to form a government under first past the post. It doesn't really work. We can experiment with coalitions if that's what elections throw up, but they don't really work unless you actually have a voting system where you then form a government that actually represents shades of opinion on a spectrum which are all represented. So I think we need to look at that. I think it's incredibly important, particularly where we are at the moment in this sort of quite bad-tempered debate that we're having in this country and in America as well, to understand that in democracy you have to make room for dissent. And people don't agree, and you have to find ways of continuing a debate without excluding those who disagree with you. And having covered the Scottish referendum, there were lots of incredibly positive things about that, sort of the excitement in the streets, the way that everyone, any bus you got on, any newsagent you walked into, everyone was debating the referendum all the time, 24 hours a day. It was wonderful. But obviously, since the referendum, it's a little bit difficult to ignore the fact that you're sort of not allowed to disagree anymore with the separatists in Scotland. And I think that we need to have a sort of cultural acceptance in our politics about respect for dissent and for constant debate and for other points of view, and that sometimes means compromise, which is completely sort of negative, and the word is totally negative associations now in a way that I really don't think it should be. And the third thing I just wanted to say is that we tend to sort of discuss democracy and political parties just as if it was only about elections and only about polling day and the results from polling day. And I think we sort of need to slightly go back to first principles about democracy as the idea of representation and ways of making decisions on behalf of everyone, because our electoral system's not really serving us. I would argue very strongly that referendums do not serve us. And I think we need to sort of go back to thinking about what democracy means. And it means, more than elections. It means the rule of law. It means equality before the law. And it means sort of civil society. So I think we also need to rediscover ways of harnessing all of those things to give us a feeling of participation and everyone being included and owning the decisions that we take as a nation. And at the moment, our political parties are not remotely delivering that.
Great. Thank you very much. Hopefully we can pick up on some of those themes when we get going. Emily? Okay. Would you like to share your thoughts?
This is such an enormous topic to grapple with, so I'm going to focus on political party membership to begin with, because I think it's actually quite an interesting issue in how it's sort of taken as one trend and then seems to have taken a different trend more recently. So from kind of 2010 to 2013, there was a lot of discussions about how political party membership was dying and people weren't interested in politics anymore, and it would all be about single issue campaign groups. And I really bought into this idea that parties were hollowed out and were in terminal decline. But in the last 2 years or so, it's changed, and it's forced me to review my opinion as well of what political party membership is doing. Again, like Miranda, I'd point to the Scottish independence referendum as a bit of a turning point. I think it was the first time in a long time that a whole society was discussing politics and a political issue. In Scotland, granted, but nevertheless, I think it showed that people on all levels and parts of society were actually interested in politics and in how their country was governed. And we've seen that follow through into SNP party membership. On the Conservative side, we saw, following last year's election and the majority that was returned, a massive flurry of interest, members joining up, people joining campaign groups like mine, and just generally being a bit more inclined to become a member of a political party. The same election last year obviously was quite important for Labour as well, because it ended up with Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party, and nothing short of a boom really in Labour Party membership for good or bad for the parliamentary party. Against this backdrop, I looked at what attitudes are doing, and every year there's a British attitude survey, and I was actually quite interested to see that since 2013 there's been a massive turnaround in attitudes towards politics. More people are interested in politics now than at any time since 1986, which is quite interesting, I think, given we had the whole New Labour project through that time. And at the same time, more people now are identifying with a particular party than any time since 1987, which again is huge. And I think all of these changes were really crystallised in the referendum that we've all just been through, this massive exercise in democracy. And I can't speak for other parties, but I know from the Conservative side, from talking to people who are part of associations up and down the country, we've experienced since June an enormous surge in membership. In my own association, it's around 20% growth in just 2 months. More people are showing that they really want to play their part in the decision-making in the country. So for me, this backdrop of kind of 20 years or even 30 years of decline of political parties and then this much more recent turnaround suggests two things. First of all, that people really are interested in politics, and probably throughout that 20, 30 years of decline, they still were quite interested in politics and parties. But the second issue there for me is the product that parties present. You know, they kind of all looked the same for a while. They haven't been particularly engaging or welcoming of their members. And I think that actually probably has quite a large part to play in why membership dropped off.
Jhanelle?
So, actually I wanted to start off by agreeing with what Emily said, but taking it from a kind of different angle. So, for me, initially, when I heard this question, my answer was like, no, I don't think political parties are over. So for me, I've only lived through Tony Blair, Coalition, David Cameron, whatever was in between that. And my kind of interpretation of British politics was that nobody really cares. It takes a lot for people to be outraged. British outrage goes as far as like getting a passive-aggressive hashtag trending on Twitter. And outside of that, it's kind of, there's more important things on TV. So I was like, I don't think political parties will be over. I think that in Britain we have kind of this culture of like flogging a dead horse, even if there's no horse literally left to flog. However, when I looked into this, actually, I was quite surprised to find statistically what Emily's saying is true. So obviously I wasn't around in the 1980s, but apparently the 1980s statistically was some golden age for politics. I don't know what was going on. But 3.8% in 1983 of the electorate voted for the main parties. That dropped to its all-time low in 2013, where it dropped to 0.8%. It since rose to 1.6% in 2016, right? We see the same thing with people voting for other parties. We see the same thing across party growth. It dropped to a historic low between about 2003, 2013, then shot up in 2015, 2016 to some random boom that nobody really knows what's going on. And this is being put down to like an anomaly. Nobody really knows why this is going on. I'm not one to really believe statistics. I don't think that statistics really portray an experience. So I was like, okay, so what do I think about 2015 and 2016? When you look at it, it's been a mad year. Mad, okay? So we've had the 2015 election. Nobody saw that coming. We've had Jeremy Corbyn twice been elected with one of the largest majority. Nobody saw that coming. We had Brexit. Nobody saw that coming. We've had Trump. Nobody saw that coming. The rise of UKIP. Nobody saw it coming. The rise of SNP. Nobody saw it coming. So what I'm getting from this is that nobody's really seeing anything coming, right? For a long time, we've been failed the mood of the electorate. Parliament and critics and all alike keep on putting on this, everyone really enjoys this kind of milky, centrist politics that we've kind of had growing. Everyone is down for this power over principle. It doesn't matter what your principles are. As long as you're in power, you can somehow change your morals about 5 years in, and you can get things that you want done. That's apparently what everyone wants, but that's not what people are actually saying. So while I was thinking that, no, Britain just carries on, it doesn't really care, that's not true at all. Brexit, whether you agree or disagree with what happened, that for me was one of the first political events that I saw that wasn't fought by the political class. It wasn't fought by economics. It wasn't fought by long economic terms. It was fought by genuine concerns of genuine people. People are trying and starting to find a passion in politics. They're starting to find what they care about, what it means to them. I don't think that necessarily means the end of party politics. I think it means the end of political class. I think it means the end of the disenfranchisement of people that Parliament has put on to try and sweep people out the way, we understand that you have opinions, but you don't know like what GDP means. You don't know exactly what the Home Office does. So I don't think you're qualified to talk on this. I think those days are slowly moving to an end. I think people are finding a passion. They're finding what they care about, and that is messy. That's why we're seeing a polarization. That's why we're seeing Trump. That's why we're seeing Nigel Farage. That's why we're seeing Jeremy Corbyn, because people are swinging out to the ends of their spectrum and finding what it is they care about. That doesn't mean that Conservative and Labour have to go, but it does mean that if they want to continue, they need to reevaluate their own parties and find out what made them start in the beginning. They didn't start out as, we're all going to crawl towards the centre and we're all going to say kind of the same thing, but then I'll change this bit, you can take that bit, and maybe between us we can get hung parliament and we can, talk about it back door and get a government in. Those days are over. That doesn't mean that we have to abolish our whole system. That means we just need to relook, and we need to put back together Parliament and people. We need to put back together politics and people. And you need to go back to the beginning and build it up from there. You don't need to wreck it all to the ground.
Quite a lot there to think about. James, thank you very much for joining us. Are you ready?
Yes, I am. I'm sorry I'm not Douglas Carswell. As you know, I haven't had much time to prepare this. I've had zilch time, which actually suits me fantastically, because I bloody well hate preparing for these things. You normally spend far, far too long. One of the things, whenever I'm going to do a public speaking engagement, one of the things that always concerns me is, what are my audience going to be like? Because I've died horribly on various occasions, and normally it's been about pitching my speech at slightly the wrong level, the wrong kind of political level particularly. I would imagine, guessing, that most of you would not like to define yourselves by anything in particular, because you're all kind of crazy maverick individuals, right? But if you had to put a label on yourself, you might consider yourself something like libertarianish left, maybe. No? Yeah? Ish? Some of you agree with that. Some of you obviously disagree violently. I too have problems when people ask me what my politics are. People who don't know me very well assume I'm just a Tory because it's an insult and it means I'm a bad thing, and they don't have to engage with my views because they've labelled me already. I have sometimes in the past I've called myself a libertarian. The problem with libertarian, I find, is I think it should be an adjective rather than a noun, because what you always find libertarians doing when two or three are gathered together is playing the more libertarian than thou game. What, you mean you don't want heroin dealers to sell heroin to school children? Well, you're not very libertarian. You don't want to invite the entire world to come and live in Britain. This is the Adam Smith Institute line at the moment. Then you're not a libertarian. So I tend to sort of fudge it. I say, yeah, I'm a classical liberal, because I believe in small government, or I'm a conservatarian, I'm a kind of South Park conservative. But here we are at an event which is being staged by one of my total heroines I love, Claire Fox. But Claire Fox comes from living Marxism, so does Mick Hume, Tiffany Jenkins, Brendan O'Neill. And there's barely a cigarette paper's difference between their political views and my political views. We differ on a few issues, probably the monarchy and stuff like that, maybe private education, I don't know. Although I've heard Claire arguing on the Moral Maze before now that she wished every school could be like Eton, and I rather agree with that. So I think we can agree on one thing. We are all slightly uncomfortable with labels, and probably we can also agree that right now there isn't a party out there that really represents our views. I'm currently a member of two parties for complicated reasons, of UKIP, which I joined in the days when it was talking about exciting stuff like flat taxes, and I joined the Conservatives in order to get a cheap pass to the Conservative conference. I don't think it's helpful for a journalist being affiliated to a particular party. I think it has a deleterious effect on their journalism. I think journalists should be independent. I agreed very strongly with something Jhanelle said about the EU referendum. I think that was the only political event in my life where I felt genuinely involved in the political process, where something truly extraordinary happened. For the first time in my life, I felt that my vote really, really mattered. And often it doesn't. I mean, I lived in London for a long time, and I voted for my MP, who happened to be Labour. I voted in 2 elections, I voted Labour, and I certainly wasn't voting for the bloody Labour Party. I was voting for Kate Hoey, because I liked her, and she supports fox hunting, which is good in my book. I thought it was very brave of her to do that in the Labour Party. But I wasn't happy when Labour, when they were in government at all. And I have to say I wasn't very happy when David Cameron was in government either. I thought that was appalling. And I'm not even sure I'm convinced by the current lot. But I think most of us can probably agree that the Brexit was a fantastic moment. I remember going to have my hair cut by Charlotte, the girl who does my hair, and we were talking about Brexit, and she was asking me rather nervously which way I was going to vote, and I said, I am totally going to vote leave. I don't like the tyrannical European superstate. I believe in freedom. I think we should be free to forge our own destiny. And she couldn't believe it. She thought I was a toff, which I'm not, but she said, I thought people like you were all voting Remain. And do you know what? She was actually rather right, in that a lot of my smarter friends, particularly the ones who'd been to school, aka Eton, they did seem unusually unhealthily drawn to voting Remain. And I would quiz them on this, and I would try and get a sort of a solid argument as to why it was a good thing to remain in this corrupt, sclerotic superstate. And all they could come up with sort of airy ideas like, well, I think it would be really sad if Henrietta and Jonty can't go and live whatever country they want to do. And I thought, yeah, you really are feeling the pain. I would like to think that what most of us here believe in is liberty, the right to determine our own destiny. And I think most of us here are actually on the right side of the argument. And our enemy is the political class. I mean the political class, I mean this cosy stitch-up between the bankers, the lawyers, the big corporations and the political class. And I think that is where the true fight lies now. I think we're revolutionaries. Thank you.
Thank you. Finally, Mike.
Thanks, Niall. Yeah, I'll try and help James out with some of his problems of labels. I think we all struggle with problems of political labels. And in a sense, we're all emerging from the detritus of failed political models and failed political parties. So I'd just like to survey briefly my experience of failed political models by way of introducing the discussion. One model that has certainly failed is that of the Bolshevik Party. Now, I start by saying that because when I was a student in the early 70s, I believed that we needed just such a party to tackle the problems that were thrown up by the advent of the recession in the capitalist system that ended 3 decades of post-war expansion and stability. And I wasn't alone in this view at the time. What many of us believed, that what was required was not merely a change of government, but a fundamental transformation in the social system that was to be led by a revolutionary party based in the working class, which would overthrow the capitalist state, install the dictatorship of the proletariat, and supervise the transition from capitalism to communism. I spent much of the next 20 years engaged in trying to realise exactly such a project. And don't think I'm breaking any confidences by saying this project was not successful. As things turned out, the radical upsurge that was part of the experience of my generation at the end of the 60s and the early 70s wasn't the harbinger of a new revolutionary era. It was more the last gasp of the era that opened with the first emergence of the working class onto the stage of world politics in 1848. And that movement ended between 1848 and roughly the end of the 1980s with a series of defeats for the labour movement at home and abroad, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, the end of the whole polarisation of labour and capital left and right, all came to an end. It marked the end of the working class as an agent of political change. Now, that was a defeat. It wasn't just a defeat for me. wasn't just a defeat for a whole movement. It was a significant setback for the whole project of realising fundamental political change. Now, that's one exhausted model. In the 1990s, many people believed that the end of communism, the end of that era, would be succeeded. This was the moment for the Social Democratic Party. But particularly striking, this was a view that this would happen in Eastern Europe. That over the last century, these parties existed everywhere. They'd offered various forms of state socialism as a way of an alternative to either overthrowing capitalism or just living with capitalism. And it seemed to be, there was a sort of notion that would now, the moment had arrived that sort of movement would attract political support. As we know, it spectacularly didn't. That people's experience of state socialism, of nationalised industries, of welfare capitalism in the various countries that it was attempted was a very negative one, and people were very disillusioned and alienated from that. And so members drifted away from the old social democratic parties, the votes declined, as we know, and right-wing governments of various sorts succeeded. But what was interesting here was that the removal of the pole of left-wing politics as a focus of influence on the social democratic movement had a very significant effect in encouraging the drift of these social democratic parties to the centre as they tried to cling on to their working class base and appeal to a wider middle class sort of support. As we know, that culminated in Britain in New Labour, which ended in the spectacular failure. The Corbyn ascendancy confirms the death agony of Labourism, really, as it's the mainstream has failed to come to terms with the modern era. There's a sort of movement in, if we could talk about it in more detail, the character of it, that doesn't, that seeks in a way to revive the corpse of Labourism by installing a sort of antiquated state socialism in accommodation with a fashionable environmentalism and and identity politics. That's not going to fly. But so that's the second model that I think is significantly exhausted. The final model we can look at is that of the Conservative Party. It's quite interesting. When this discussion was first mooted in the summer, it seemed like all the parties were in the process of disintegration. But as we know, the one which spectacularly got its show back on the road was the Conservative Party, confirming its status as the most successful political party in modern European history. Theresa May then used the Conservative Party conference to reposition the Tory party as a party of the working class, very astutely, in my view. But what you see here is a sort of domino effect. The collapse of the revolutionary parties, the collapse of the reformist parties, also removes a very significant source of influence on the Conservative Party. Douglas Carswell, I'm very sorry he isn't here as well, actually, because I've gone to the trouble of reading his book, which is a penance. But it's not without some rewarding aspects. One of the points that Douglas Carswell well understands is he makes the point the modern Conservative Party was formed in response to the challenge of the rising Labour movement in the 1920s. I think that's quite an astute observation, because obviously the Conservative Party existed before that, but in its modern form, it emerged in response to the challenge of Labour, and it has survived and thrived through the 20th century precisely in the working out of that challenge. Can it survive the disappearance of such a challenge? I think that's very much, and the whole Brexit phenomenon, that some of the aspects have been discussed, really brings that into question. So finally, Brexit. Chairman Mao, him say, everything under heaven is utter chaos. The situation is excellent. 17.5 million people voted against their betters. And in the inimitable words of Corporal Jones, they don't like it, up 'em. And this was a dramatic, and there was an interesting discussion about this already today, completely unexpected, as Jhanelle says, courageous statement of the British demos against defying the advice of all their betters and that endless list of acronyms and authorities who told them that they should vote for Remain. This is a momentous and exhilarating moment in British politics. 17.5 million people, the biggest number of people has been widely commented upon that have ever voted for anything. And what's most striking is the miserable nature of the response to this dramatic moment, that it inculcates widely dreams of a return to the status quo ante. And you see all these former politicians offering their services. David Miliband, Tony Blair's even You almost expect next week David Cameron will be coming back to say if his services are required. Everybody yearns desperately for the old ding-dong left and right and centre to be resumed. It's not going to happen. The old order is not going to take place. Some people recognise the challenge and the opportunity of this moment. Where it goes, I have to make a serious confession to you, I do not know. But I know that what we do need now is not to try and revive the corpses of the old parties. We need something new. We need some new ideas, we need some new organisations, and we need some new arguments. We need a new politics to rise to the occasion of what the Brexit voters put on the agenda.
We thank our speakers, everybody. Quite a lot to take in there. We've got a lot of people here, so I'm going to take some questions here and then I'll bring the people back in later.
Keith Sutherland, who's the editor of my publisher, Imprint Academic, he wrote a book called The Party's Over. This is quite a few years ago now. His proposal was that we abolish the House of Commons and the House of Lords. We have reconstituted a single house full of experts, not elected, but then we get a glorified jury system. So people are on long-term jury service, quite a number of them. They sit observing the debate of the experts in the reconstituted House, and it's they, the jury, that make the decisions. Then, of course, eventually, after a few months or whatever, you get rid of that and you replace them with another set of people as a jury. So that was his book, The Party's Over. That's the only sort of semi-coherent outline of an alternative party system I've heard. I'd be interested to hear any others.
Great.
As you know, that Jeremy Corbyn's been elected back in as the leader of the Labour Party. Do you honestly think that Labour is electable, or do you think we're going to be stuck with Tory rule for decades?
In the French Revolution, the argument made then before elections was that they limited democracy in a way that actually made it easier for the aristocracy to retain control. And I wonder if the reason why the Occupy movement swept the world and then disappeared like a puff of smoke is because it promised a more egalitarian way of making decisions and then failed to deliver and replaced any idea about actually some goals and demands with merely getting on with the process and celebrating the process. And I think it'd be worthwhile doing some more experimenting and maybe reclaiming C.L.R. James's argument in Every Cook Can Govern, a very good essay he wrote some years ago, and to go back to some system of governing by drawing lots from citizens, which was the way that they did in ancient Athens. And I know they had a smaller democracy then, etc., etc. But there's the 21st century. We have the internet. It should not be beyond the wit of man to work out some technical ways of kick-starting a form of democracy and a form of governing ourselves that doesn't end up just being voting every 5 years for, we know what the result of that is.
Great.
So it's a suggestion.
Two quick questions, if I may. One is an often asked question, which is, what is the point of UKIP? And the second question is really an observation as much as a question, and that is that we appear to be on the cusp of trying to decide whether we're a society as a collective or whether we're actually a society of individuals, because this seems to be an area of polarisation or potential polarisation between the left and right.
I think we should pick up Miranda's challenge to be experimental, and there are loads of potential initiatives rather than just focusing on the classic Liberal Democrat one of electoral reform. So, for example, there's this paper, with which I generally disagree, which is calling for endorsed candidates to topple Eurosceptics at another forthcoming general election. Candidates that are endorsed cross-party but would allow Europhiles to get the sort of commons that they want. That's one initiative. And there is a possibility for a similar initiative against prominent Europhiles from those of us that voted to leave. There is a possibility of open primaries. I would love to see the selection of MPs being something which is genuinely controlled by the community. There should be less regulation of political parties, and then perhaps we'd have more of them to allow tastes such as your peculiar left libertarian minority to be truly represented in our decision-making. I'd love there to be, for example, a youth party, and yes, I'm looking at you. Why isn't there a party which is genuinely acting for the benefit of that most marginalised section of our society, the teens and tweens?
Okay,
and one last one, I would adamantly disagree with Miranda's point about referenda. I think referenda are great. Mind you, I've just won one.
Okay, thank you.
So regardless of whether or not parties are here to go or here to stay, there seems to be some general consensus that something has to change and we're playing some role in it. But in terms of either altering the parties that currently exist or dragging them down, toppling them, what have you, what practical means can actually be taken? Because you actually said the word revolutionary, and I think that's a bit of, that's not accurate. I don't think that people are particularly radical. And so, what are the means to causing change?
Great, thank you.
I just wanted to respond to the comment that the panelist on the end made about us all being interested in liberty. Personally, I'm interested in ethics and equality and justice more than I am in liberty. Even if my liberty is constrained, those things are more important to me.
Great, thank you. I'll take one more point and then we'll bring the panel back in if they've got anything to say.
Yeah, I just wanted to disagree with you about open primaries. I think if looking at America, that leads to an awful situation where just about every candidate starts by appealing very far right or left and swinging to the centre, regardless of what they've said before. Perhaps a simpler and better idea would be to just allow each party to put as many candidates as they want, and we have a system where you can vote for more than one candidate. So presumably people would start off by selecting a party and then sort of narrow it down to the individual candidate, but all in one ballot.
Great. Can we go back to Miranda? Have you got any points to make on what any of the other panellists have said or point answers?
Yeah, so citizens' juries seem to be quite popular with everyone so far. And I think it is a really interesting idea, actually, this idea that you kind of select people to serve. If we trust a jury to make incredibly important decisions about other, our fellow citizens' life and liberty, we should certainly trust them to make decisions or contribute to a deliberative process in that way. I'm not sure, by the way, it's not that I don't think any referendum is a good idea ever, but I think that you have to have all these other things in place, because otherwise you get this kind of slightly odd snapshot. I think it has to be part of a kind of consultative process where everyone is included. That's my objection. The future of UKIP, gentleman asked about the future of UKIP. Yeah, it's really interesting this, because obviously you could answer differently every 2 weeks because the situation changes and the leader changes. But I do think they'll have a role for some considerable time, actually, not least because of what we're going through at the moment. Their role will be sort of harrying the Conservative Party and harrying Theresa May, and also because of the collapse of the Labour Party, all those traditional Labour areas, particularly in the northeast, Wales, etc. UKIP is very, very strong there. It came a good second, a good third. So long as they can sort out this leadership issue, they have a future, definitely. I'll leave it there.
A lot of points from the floor, so there's quite a lot to cover. I find the question of Labour's future really quite interesting, being kind of traditionally the Conservatives' key opponent. Not very promising, I would say. I think Corbyn is unelectable, but I think maybe the parliamentary Labour Party has a bit of an opportunity if it were to split. I think there's some people who still maybe would get votes. I also found the question about whether we should look at society as a collective or as individuals quite interesting. I'm a libertarian, like many of the people here, so I firmly come down on the side of individuals and protecting individual liberty and rights. I think that's possibly the biggest split we have in politics now. I would hope it is.
Yes, no, I agree with that point. And to the lady who said that she values equality more than liberty, well, okay, ethics and equality. You're right. There can be absolutely no meeting of minds between us because the two are inimical. And I say that not as somebody who doesn't care about people or fluffy bunny rabbits or whatever. It's just that empirically throughout history, you only have to look at the grand schemes that have been imposed on people to make things fairer. They always end up making things worse. The point about Jeremy Corbyn and Labour, I quite agree that Corbyn has pretty much guaranteed Labour will be out of office forever. Whatever happened to the party of the people, the party that represented the working man and woman? Surely that was the correct and laudable purpose of Labour, and now it's become the party of the quangocrat and the welfare class. And by the welfare class, by the way, I don't just mean the unemployed. I mean people like Mark Carney, I mean, people like the BBC. There's a whole class of people who I think are part of that, well, closely related to that other horrible thing that I hate, civil society. I worry a great deal that some of you have been asking questions like, what new thing can we introduce to make everything better? How about not having new things to try and make things better? How about government getting out of the way of our lives and leaving us alone?
Great, thank you very much. Jhanelle?
Yeah, I just wanted to answer three things really quickly. So you said about youth, a youth party. Young people are pretty much kept out of politics as much as they can. The youth actually do have their own parliament, which is what I sat on, except they try as hard as they can to make sure that we're not in parliament. So you have one sitting a week. It's run exactly like parliament, except it's apolitical, so there's no parties.
European Parliament, really.
I guess you could make a few comparisons. But yeah, so young people do have, in a sense, a political party, but yeah, that's another story. To answer the Jeremy Corbyn question and the how do we change question, I want to answer them together. So we can't just change politics. I think people keep on saying, like, how are we going to change political parties? How are we going to change the political system? If you want to change politics truly, you need to change so many things in society. I think that media has a huge effect in modern day politics. I think social media has a huge effect in modern day politics. I think that we are trying to carry on an old system in a new society. So it's not as simple as, can we get rid of political parties and introduce new ones? Because we have a slant on how politics is introduced to people, if this is making sense. So that wouldn't work. And to bring in the Jeremy Corbyn thing, personally, I think Jeremy Corbyn could be elected. As I was saying before, about how we try and judge the electorate, people said that Jeremy Corbyn wouldn't be elected the first time. They said it definitely wouldn't happen the second time. It did happen. Let's just stop guessing. Let's just leave it to people to vote how they want to vote. There was one of my favourite quotes, sorry to be the controversial one, one of my favourite quotes was, if Owen Smith did win, it would be a bit awkward because it'd be like getting into a cold bath that Ed Miliband and Tony Blair left for him. So, let's just keep it open is my answers.
Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, I completely agree with Jhanelle on that point. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn is quite capable of winning an election. Anything can happen, as Jhanelle has observed in what's happened in the last year. And, you only have to look at Corbyn. He has negative charisma in spades. And that is something which is, in the current political moment, can carry you along with. Look, the more incompetent he is in managing the party, the more incoherent his speech is, the more reactionary his political positions are, the greater his success has been in the Labour Party. So he could incontrovertibly win an election. Anything can happen. But the point is, what would be the use of that? What on earth possible advantage would it be to anybody for him to win an election? I think the outlook that actually goes back beyond Corbyn, and you can see its emergence. I think the slogan that really summed up the mentality of the Corbyn phenomenon is the great slogan of the anti-Iraq war demonstration in 2003, "Not in my name." It's that sense of that there's a war going on here. We don't want to take any action to frustrate it or undermine it in any way. We accept it's going to happen, but count me out of it. You carry on, leave me out of it. It's nothing to do with me. And I think that expresses the upsurge of membership in many respects of the new Corbyn Labour Party. It's membership without involvement, activity without direction. It's about me. It's about expressing something. I am the sort of person who identifies with the Corbyn phenomenon. It's an expression of a combination of resentment and disillusionment and disenchantment. And it doesn't seem to me it has any, what you might call in old-fashioned terms, progressive content whatsoever. So I think that's the situation, and that's the pathetic nature of the moment that we're in. When the great events of the June the 23rd had settled down, everything is reduced to talking about Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, what planet are we all living on? Momentum. I'm involved in just very briefly, Niall, sorry. I'm involved in a local campaign in Haringey against the closures in adult social care facilities in the borough, which are of a catastrophic scale. My wife's very actively involved. She went along to a Momentum meeting and suggested, this was in the summer when the Corbyn campaign was at its height, great to see all these people. What are we going to do about the cuts in Haringey Council? Can we leave that for another day? We're talking about getting Jeremy Corbyn elected to the Labour Party. There's no grassroots activism to achieve any political objective here. It's all conceived in these extraordinarily narrow and inward-looking, backward-looking above all, terms.
Can I just say something about that? I'm not sure I totally agree, Michael, actually, in that when you talk to the older, more experienced people in Momentum, that's exactly what it's about. It's this kind of comforting group hug, stage left, without any desire to kind of change anything in the real world. But it's not all like that. And actually there are a lot of people who have a lot of energy and do want to make an actual real contribution, particularly the younger people. And what I think's a shame is they're sort of under the power of the people that you're talking about. If they had a proper outlet for that energy, they could really be involved.
I was kind of taken by Mike's, the new possibilities, and that's what kind of inspired me to put this together. Where are we going? What can we do? I'd really like to hear what you think about, get some juicy questions and juicy ideas about what we can do. Do we want to carry on with the old things, or is there something new that we can do?
What's so exciting about the referendum was the size of the decision that people are involved in. It wasn't just the turnout. And I think when Miranda and others are talking about experiments, there's the last 20 years is a graveyard of experiments involving people in decision-making. For example, Margaret Thatcher very effectively took the decision away from people to decide how much public money was spent on housing, but she gave everyone the power to decide what colour their drains were painted. So I think there's a whole history of experiments where actually politics has become narrowed. So it's actually the size of the decisions people are making are smaller and smaller. And that's, for me, that's the biggest problem. John Major responded to a lot of Thatcher's technical reorganisation of the political structures by giving people smaller and smaller decisions. So you can decide this small, very small geographical area, how we spend this £150,000. It's a joke, the history of experiments on trying to involve people in politics.
Okay, great, thank you.
In America, individual states are often referred to as the laboratories of democracy. In Britain, our government is incredibly centralised in Westminster. Where are our laboratories?
Great.
I think a discussion about new political parties has to start with the policies of those new parties rather than what kind of organisational or historical form they might take. So I think really we need to be talking about what new politics means. And some of the things that have been mentioned here are the big issues of the day, which at the moment are not reflected through political organisation. For example, the point that James made is about the opposition between freedom, as in free speech, and equality, as in all the people who want to deny free speech on lots of numbers of issues, is a dividing line which should be reflected in a political party. The people who believe in national sovereignty, who voted for Brexit, as opposed to the people who voted against it and for forms of corporate undemocratic government, those should be reflected in different political parties. The idea of economic growth versus the environmentalist anti-growth policies should be reflected in different political parties. These are the big issues of the day. And when we've decided what side we're on in those kinds of discussions, then they can start to take a political form.
My question is about one about devolution. So we see like in Scotland and in Wales, like with Plaid Cymru and things like that. Do you think devolution might be the answer to like the political party problem? Because like a lot of it's controlled by Westminster, and then you link it back to the EU referendum about Brussels. People didn't like it being controlled in Brussels, and then about the fact that with party politics and this like civic jury system and things, I don't think many people really care about the small decisions that are made within politics. Like, people don't mind about the day-to-day running of politics, they care about the big issues. So how would people get involved and engaged with the small day-to-day running of politics?
Okay. Thanks.
I was struck by the panellist who said how lots of politicians didn't see lots of things coming. And I think that's a very good way of summing up the problems that our political class has at the moment. And it's worth asking why that is. I mean, I would say it's because they simply don't have the ability to understand political ideas at the moment. There's no overarching philosophy that people can readily deploy to understand what's happening in society. To a large extent, that's because class politics has died. And it died about 30 years ago, and a lot of people have failed to understand that class is no longer a meaningful way of understanding society. What has tended to develop in place of any class analysis is a dynamic between the elite and the people. In other words, elite ideas develop from people who define themselves by cutting themselves off from the rest of society. So the elite love experts. They love lawyers. They love quangos. In fact, they love anyone who also defines themselves as members of the elite. In other words, members who also disconnect themselves from society. And so what you have here is a whole set of ideas and beliefs and policies which are entirely divorced from the concerns and understandings of ordinary people. And whenever I talk about the elite versus the people, the elite members, they always self-identify themselves because they bristle with anger at the fact that they have been called out. They hate the fact that they have been pointed out as being members of the elite. With that rider in mind, I wonder if the panellists could say whether or not they think this dynamic is a useful way of understanding society.
Great, thank you.
I totally agree with that point about the elite. It is the problem today. Yeah.
Right.
I agree as well. I think it's a really interesting way of understanding politics at the moment, and I think a lot of people feel that as well, that politicians are disconnected. But the one thing I would say is that I think the responsibility for that isn't just with the political elite. I think a lot of people generally have turned off from politics and ignored it, and we're basically letting them get away with it.
This thing about big versus small decisions, I mean, I'm not remotely suggesting that everyone should just be given, the colour of their drain cover or whatever that appalling example was. I mean, this is a recommendation that really big issues be tackled with mass participation. And, in Ireland, they rewrote the country's constitution, which, of course, in a country where you have church and state very close, was a huge moment for the nation. And everyone got involved through this system of selecting people like a citizen's jury. And it was an incredibly careful process with votes, referenda, and the input of these people who considered the question deeply on behalf of their fellow citizens. So I'm not recommending drain covers. I am recommending big issues be participated in more.
I just wanted to make the point, sort of passed on a bit now, but I agreed with James's response on the issue of the primary significance of liberty in relation to the issue that raised about equality and ethics. It's very interesting, and this example was made of the French Revolution. If you look at the French Revolution, the American Revolution, these were not fought in the name of equality. They were fought in the name of liberty. And that's also true of the Levelers and the Chartists. They fought for liberty because they understood that the freedom to elect your own government was critical to the development of any other form of political progress, including, as it happens, the advancing of an agenda of greater equality in society. It will be widely known, of course, that the American Constitution did not get rid of slavery. It did not emancipate women, but it created the democratic framework within which those developments could take place. So I think that it's absolutely crucial to cling to liberty, freedom, as the absolute bedrock of democratic principles, because without liberty, and this is the key of the European referendum, without the freedom to elect your own government that is in control of your own affairs, you've got nothing.
Do you want to make any quick point?
I just wanted to make a quick point about the elitism point, going on from what I said, a point I tried to make earlier but didn't make very clearly. I think that the reason politicians didn't see it coming is, I do think it's that politicians have completely disenfranchised themselves from people, and they have this whole kind of idea of it doesn't really matter what we say, it's what people want us to say, but then people don't really know what they want politicians to say. So everyone is kind of crowded in the centre because they don't really want to be too controversial. So I think that when people started having opinions and people were like, so with Brexit, actually, you know, I think I want to leave, or I do think immigration is an issue, or I think this and I think that, politicians were like, whoa, this isn't what you asked for like 10 years ago, can everyone calm down? So I don't think politicians did see it coming, and I think that Parliament is trying to carry on like everything's fine and are trying to ignore the mandate of the people for change. So I think that there was a shock, but also that people don't know how to deal with it, so they're carrying on with the old system.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. One very brief comment and one very brief question. The comment refers to something James said. He said a lot of interesting things, but one thing he said made me think every cloud has a silver lining, and the silver lining for the Labour Party is called Kate Hoey. So I agree 100% with you on that. My question is to Mike, in line with the question from the chair, if he could sort of expand a bit what he means by bringing in new things, but with a word of caution, as a self-confessed, contrite, ex-failed Bolshevik, keeping that failure in mind, maybe be careful what you wish for.
I live in Switzerland. When I come here, everyone's very keen on referendums, and they say, isn't it great in Switzerland because the government's very weak and we have rule by referenda? Well, I can tell you that that technical fix doesn't actually work. In Switzerland, we have exactly the same problems that you have in the UK, which is that we vote to control our borders, and then we're not allowed to because we suddenly find out that the people are not sovereign, and the Parliament is sovereign, or it's the European Convention on Human Rights, or it's bilateral agreements, and it's the dilution of the sovereignty of the people. So it strikes me that I know the word nationalism is very unpopular, but maybe we do need a new sense of national identity, a new, more progressive sense of it, in the sense of control and power over our sovereignty, and the assertion of that. And for that, you need an active demos. And in Switzerland, they say that the parliament is sovereign, not the people. You can't have two sovereigns. You have the same problem here in the UK. Is parliament sovereign or are the people sovereign? It can't be both. Only one of them can be in charge. And I say it should be with the people. But for that, we need to find our sense of national identity.
Got it, thanks.
So I think the establishment, the system, the political parties are so ingrained and has so much inertia about them that any effort to try and change the system is a red herring and is just going to just suck an enormous amount of energy out and never get anywhere. I do think that the political parties, the systems are kind of like shells, and they're full of people, and the people are full of ideas, and changing ideas is certainly an achievable aim. And then obviously if you're most effective at that, you can start to change the people within the system. But I think if one wants to do something, I think one should start with a single idea one wants to change and really focus one's energy on that and try to be successful at that. And the more successful you are at changing one idea, then maybe start to bring 2 or 3 or 4. And if you suddenly find that all the people you brought together with you are all agreed about changing 50 ideas, then you've got a movement. But I think, if we want to change something, we should start with ideas.
Great. Thank you very much.
Should we limit professional politicians who've had no practical experience, so trades union leaders or businessmen or people who've done real work, actually only being allowed to enter the political system once they've got some experience? So let's say once they're over 45 and then only being limited in the amount of years that they can serve as politicians. So we actually have some practicalities.
Thank you very much.
I think one of the interesting things about the referendum was that no party campaigned for Brexit, and that many politicians from each party kind of, broke ranks, particularly within the Labour Party. And what you have post the election is a number of organisations that have popped up to cross-party organisations like Change Britain, for example. So that indicates to me that, there's not a lot of continuity within the parties at the moment. The question that I think is most pertinent at the moment is about one of democracy, and it's about the people were asked a question through the referendum that, as this woman here indicated, was very serious, and we took it seriously, but now there's some very serious attempts at undermining that decision. And so a number of people around here today have set up something called Invoke Democracy Now, which is a way of coming together people who recognise that the outcome of the referendum was democratically reached at and are prepared to come together, whether you voted Remain or Leave or you abstained, to defend the outcome of the referendum and defend our democracy and work out what that looks like.
Great.
Lessons from America, as it were. We haven't mentioned
what seems to be happening there is very much the end of the two great political parties. I don't think the Tories are going to continue without serious problems in this country. And if Labour is having any sort of resurgence, it's no more than a dead cat bounce. I think it's pretty clear that the old political parties are finished for the good reasons that people are talking about. They don't reflect the current issues, and freedom and equality are a very key part of the ongoing sort of cultural wars. But then on the other hand, there are new political parties, and we haven't mentioned those either. The Front National, a big article in the FT today about showing their effectiveness in France in transforming themselves into a working class party. Alternative for Deutschland in Germany with their recent electoral success. There are new political parties coming up around issues and being effective in organising people. So just those two aspects, I wonder what the panel think about that, the end of the old and the beginning of the new. Is that a dynamic? But all this seems to happen against a backdrop of a long-running trend of degradation in democracy, a stepping back from political engagement. I don't think, despite the excitement of Brexit, I'm not sure that that long-running trend away from democratic engagement has stopped. I don't think technical reforms or new political parties are just suddenly going to be thrown in front of a demos which is hungry for something. I'm not so convinced. I mean, is not a lot of this debate within the political class, within the media, and not so much reflecting what's happening on the ground, which often I think is not that much.
Great, thank you. I'm going to bring the speakers back in and then go back out.
Just on the last point there, I'd like to offer a defence of the health of the Conservative Party. I think that in these kind of troubled times where there are lots of disagreements, it's very easy to imagine that in the past everybody always agreed on everything. I think when you have two main parties, as we have done in this country, it's inevitable that you won't agree on everything. I think the issue now for parties like the Conservative Party and perhaps Labour as well, if they've got it in them, is to find the common ground. It's inevitable that we will disagree within the party on lots of things, but where are the agreements? The other thing I just want to come back to is the earlier point from the previous round of questions about involving people more in decision making and giving people more big decisions. As a libertarian, I live in fear of what sometimes is called the tyranny of the majority. And so my answer to that question is to roll back the size of the state, and then people can make more decisions, but make them for themselves and their families rather than imposing them on other people.
Great, thank you. Miranda, have you got any thoughts?
Yeah, just a thought on this really interesting individual versus collective thought which came up. I think somebody asked a question, but we've all kept returning to it because it's so important. I mean, I'm an individualist and I value freedom almost above all. But on the other hand, I have to tell you that when I had children, I had women in my sort of baby group who said, before I had a child, I didn't actually realise what the state was for. And the state exists, and something that equates to a sort of collective exists to protect the weak from the strong and to support people. So you do have to have both, and I think it can become a bit of a false opposition. We all take a position on that spectrum to do with valuing individual freedom versus the collective. I'm not in the Labour Party because I don't have that attraction to the collective, for example, as an ideal. But you do have to understand that both are necessary.
There's a lot of discussion or suggestion of various alternatives to kind of answer the crisis of the democratic moment. But what seems to strike me about all of them is that, I'm talking about things like sortition, the balloting of people as the Irish constitutional model, or devolution, or primaries, or e-petitions, or I-politics in all its various forms. They all seem to me to have the effect of being less democratic than the current system. They all try to increase the authority of experts over the voice of the people in various ways. Devolution is a very good example of that. I mean, the whole point of devolution as it was developed was entirely top down. There wasn't a demand from, in the early devolution referendums, they had a great deal of difficulty getting any interest in them at all, particularly in Scotland and Wales. Particularly in Wales, a bit more in Scotland, but there was no great popular demand for them. It was a sense of the political elite trying to find more legitimacy for itself by going out to these other forms of of representation. The EU is another form of the same thing. You know, people in England want to have democratic control over the Parliament in Westminster, because that's what people understand for hundreds of years is what they fought for, what they understand is the key to their government. And whatever mechanisms that we have to talk about, I think talking about the mechanisms is itself rather narrow technical focus on the discussion. We need to focus on that issue. The USA is a very interesting model in many respects, because I mean, somebody made the point about the history of, you know, that representative democracy was introduced after the American Revolution precisely as a device for curbing the expression of the democratic will of the people, precisely because the elite feared the democratic expression of the people, but had to, because in the whole nature of the American society at that time, it wasn't possible to subvert that explicitly. So representative democracy was introduced as a way of curbing that, and indeed celebrated. Edmund Burke, of course, famously took it over as the model for the development of conservative politics in Britain. So those political parties have historically played that kind of role of containing the expression of the democratic will. On the other hand, it's also the fact that people who are trying to exert a greater degree of control over their lives and over their governments have found the vehicle of political parties a way of achieving this. That is the thing about democracy. It's hard work. It requires a constant engagement and activity of people in making it work. And that's why we've got political parties that have failed. We need to have new political parties. You see, they're trying to revive the old ones. I think the general discussion there's a bit of a consensus on that, apart from our representative of the Conservative Party. But, you know, it's finished. So we need to have a sense of the role that some sort of political party can serve in mediating between the individual and the political system, because that is going to be essential to any form of political progress that we can make. And that moment is particularly pressed upon us by the Brexit phenomenon, because we have got this mass democratic upsurge, but we have no vehicle for carrying it forward. And indeed, we have got a problem of a public mood which is rather sullen and cynical and fatalistic, and needs to be challenged with the spirit of new ideas, and that new political formations can begin. But we're starting from a very low base.
Jhanelle, Mike's point about wanting new political parties made me think of a point that I want to ask you and Emily. Partly why the two youngest people on the panel are members of two of the oldest parties around. And I know Angus said something about new parties, but it struck me that there are new movements, lots of new kind of ephemeral things that pop up and disappear quite quickly. I mean, is it the 50th anniversary of the Black Panthers this year? You know, why nothing like the Pink Panthers? I know. I was getting them mixed up with the gay movement. The Pink Panthers, you know, Black Lives Matter. You know, the scene today, it seems much more about these movements that just come and go. Why does it require more commitment?
Before I answer that, can I just quickly come to what a gentleman at the front said about should we limit politicians to over 45? No. For various reasons, I don't think that would be a very sensible idea. I think that we should aim for a diverse, and that doesn't mean a forged diverse where you look at people and you're like, yeah, they seem pretty diverse. I mean people who represent different, and that means different ages. To go back to what you said about a youth party, I think that they're coming at it, I guess, from a young perspective. My issue with having only over 45 representatives, or only representatives that have done this in their life, you're just flipping the problem that you highlighted and creating it in a new sense. To go to the new parties and how people are talking about we need to get rid of the old parties, for me, I'm kind of like confused as to what people want parties to do. Because on one hand, you have Conservatives who are kind of like, we've got a lot of issues, but we're just going to pretend like we don't. And when they come up, they come up. Then you've got Labour, who are like, we've got a lot of issues, but we're going to change, and this is what we want. And how are you talking about young people? Within Momentum, but Momentum kind of gets tarnished as one group of people. They're like, you know what, we're going to change this party, we're going to make this party what we want, and that's being messy, all of that. But then that's bad. But then you're having a call for new parties as well. So what is the line of what do people want? Either way, it's going to cause a mess. So I don't think it's a case of are we ready for political parties, it's are we ready for a period of mess? Do you want to carry on? Do you want to praise the Conservatives? Do you want to tarnish Labour for being honest with their problems? Where do you want to go?
Okay, great. James, sorry, I hadn't forgotten you. We've got 15 minutes, so I want to get back out to the audience as soon as possible.
Yeah, I want to take up Miranda's point about collectivism. I do believe very much in the collective. It's called the free market. I'm sure you've all read my favourite bedtime reading, Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics. And one of the things he recounts near the beginning is how after the fall of the Soviet Union, the various Soviet commissars who were in charge of sable hat production or tractor production or whatever and deciding the quotas for the year were astonished when they came to the West and discovered that their jobs didn't exist in the West. And they asked, how can this be? How can you allocate these resources without experts to decide how many sable hats are going to be needed in Siberia or whatever? And of course the answer is that we have the market mechanism to decide that. People decide where to spend their money, and we all have different values we place on what we want, and that's how market works. One of my dividing lines at the moment, about 3 months ago, my dividing line about the good guys and the bad guys were where people voted on the referendum. Now my dividing line is, it's a fantastic bullshit detector, and some of you will be caught out by this, where you stand on the business of Michael Gove and experts. It's become a real trope among a certain kind of commentator in the chattering classes about Michael Gove thinks we don't need experts. Well, isn't that really stupid? Actually, no, it's actually very sensible. You look at what the experts have been telling us about, were telling us in the run-up to the 2008 crash. Look at what the experts are telling us about, my favourite topic, climate change. There's a lot of expert stupidity in the world, and experts are very much cherished by people who want a bigger state. I don't think that they are the solution.
Okay.
With the participation and decision-making that shape, I just wanted to ask where politics is quite a tedious business. There's lots and lots to do all the time, and there's lots to know, and that's why some experts might be quite handy, I think. So how can those decisions be made that take a lot of work, take a lot of reading, and take a lot of knowledge in that participation model, please? And with respect to one thing that Emily said, I think about liberty, the important thing is to always bear in mind the liberty of others as well.
But it's not just that politicians are out of touch with the public, but the public is also out of touch with other members of the public. I did politics A-level years ago, changed my life, got my first job, really wanted to have, looking forward to political discussions with people. Sorry, we don't discuss politics or religion. But my experience is if you can get past that, most people have got really developed political positions on things. They're just keeping it to themselves. So the question to the panel is, how do we break through that?
I was just wondering how much the panel think that the sort of decline of the political party has to do with our system of election. We've had talk about new political parties, but I want to know what good those political parties are if we have a system of election where two parties are the only parties that ever get elected, and also where nothing ever changes. We have these outbursts of people demanding huge change, like we had with the EU referendum, like we had with Jeremy Corbyn, and a similar situation in America with Donald Trump. I was wondering what the panel thought of that.
Isn't the main criticism of Jeremy Corbyn that he has principles? And that's what people are really afraid of, that he has principles. I'm not really worried if Labour don't get elected in the next election, as long as we finally have real socialism eventually. So what I think a lot of people want is a change of the paradigm and a change of the ideology.
Great, thank you.
I read a book called The Good Immigrant about a week ago, which called for a rational de-emotionalising of the debate around British immigration. And I think we can apply this kind of emotional, rational conflict to a lot of things. And I wondered whether you think that having parties and personalities in our system heighten or affect this.
I just wanted to pick up on some of the points people have made about systems involving sortition or the drawing of lots, and just sort of think about what implications that has. And you have to think about the role of political parties more traditionally. They recognise that there are groups in society who largely have shared interests, but those interests are in conflict with other groups. So traditionally, as Mike was saying, Labour versus Capital. So it sort of recognises and it represents those group interests in Parliament. What we seem to be talking about now, when we talk about representative democracy, when we talk about things like the drawing of lots, it's effectively saying that everyone's treated as an individual and we want a sort of representative section of society. So then it's like designing a research study where you want a representative group of people, as in 50-50 gender split and different ethnic minorities and different sort of range of ages and things like that, as if what defines your interests and your sort of political ideas are those sort of basic demographic factors about you. So could we have a system like that sort of relates to everyone as individuals and still have a role for shared interests and ideas? Because political parties is really about saying, these are the ideas that we stand for. This is our sort of shared vision of what future society should be like, and that's what's being represented in Parliament, not a sort of collection of individuals.
Greg.
So I just want to ask, should people on the left be pushing for Donald Trump to erect a wall with Mexico? And is that what we want to do? During the Brexit debate, I didn't see anyone coming through with an alternative idea. What I saw is people on the left and the right splitting themselves between saying, Europe is good for Britain, or Europe is not good for Britain. And democracy was positioned as being, I think by a lot of people in this room who say that they're on the left, as being, we're going to support the will of the people. I don't think that people were given a choice. The real issue during the Brexit debate is, what's the role of the EU and what's the role of the British state? I've lived here all my life, and I don't see the British state as my friend. Who in this room is willing to stand up and make that the issue?
Could we actually ban the use of this meaningless and appalling term, the voice of the people? If you talk about Brexit, we're talking about 37% of the electorate, and those people voted for very different reasons. The idea of a voice of the people smacks of Stalinism, of Mao. That's exactly the kind of phrase that was used in authoritarian societies. Can we please get rid of it?
Great, thank you very much. Can I just thank the audience for the brilliant set of questions? Thank you very much, Miranda.
I agree with the gentleman who's just spoken. I've been slightly worried by this conversation because there's so much about, expressing the popular will. If you look at really interesting data at the moment, in a lot of Western democracies, there's a crash of trust, not just in politics, but in all the institutions that make a democratic society. And what you have is an increase in trust in the system in countries where they have authoritarian regimes or they have kind of strongman leaders. This is very worrying to me, and you can talk about the popular will in the right way, but you can also talk about it in a way which is reminiscent, actually, of the way that authoritarian regimes and strongmen leaders like to use referenda to claim that they can crush dissent with legitimacy, and I think it's very worrying. And as I said before, I think dissent and protecting dissent within a democracy is an important principle in wherever we're going. The other thing that interests me was the lady over there who talked about the role of emotion and personality, because this really does play a huge role in our elections and in our system, more than we probably like to imagine. And I'm very interested in this conversation that Michael was having with the gentleman over there about Jeremy Corbyn and his principle. I think actually what people are interested in Jeremy Corbyn is this idea of sort of retailing some sort of morality in politics. I don't think it's actually about particularly what he stands for, it's this idea of morality, and I think that Theresa May's masterstroke in her conference speech was actually to pick up on this thirst for morality. I don't necessarily think it's all that healthy, but I think it's a factor in the mess that Jhanelle has described.
Okay, great, thank you very much.
So I just want to kind of not directly answer anybody's question, really, sorry, but pull on some of the things that have been said. I think we can all agree that there is a disconnect between what a political class or a political elite and the population in general. But I think the point over here was really interesting. The gentleman who said people are often keeping their views to themselves, which for me kind of begs the question, how are politicians supposed to know what people think if people aren't, sharing their views? And again, from that, then how do they know who to represent when there is such a range of views? And for me, this comes down to the fundamental question, and one of the key issues in our society today, or in a political society today, is this idea that we're kind of delegating democracy and politics to a political class. And I think whatever formulation or structure of parties or however you elect politicians, if you have a population that isn't engaged, if you don't have a proper demos, then you're going to have a problem. And I think that pushes the responsibility of the future of democracy and political parties, not just to politicians, but to everyone. So I think people need to get involved.
Great, thank you. We've got 3 minutes left, so a minute each for the last 3 speakers. Jhanelle, off you go.
Somebody asked, how do we break through the system, about personality and about Jeremy Corbyn. I think all of them is just open and honest conversations and debate, which is, I think, what we saw in one way in the running to Brexit, and I think that's why that was such a different feel towards other elections that we've had, is that people were honest with genuine concerns. It wasn't fought by political terminology or political jargon. It was fought with honest views of what honestly people wanted, and I think that needs to be aired. And how you were saying about how can politicians represent people if they don't know what we want? You need to talk about what you want. It can't be what politicians want and then people kind of slot into that. It needs to be turned over the other way, and I think that's what we need for parties to continue.
Great, thank you very much. James, very, very briefly.
Yeah. The government is not your friend. Whenever it tries to make things better, it almost invariably makes things worse. Take the red pill.
Fabulous, thank you. And Mike, finally.
Yes, another useful point I picked up from reading Douglas Carswell's book is that he makes the point in 1884, the key decision that was made wasn't to expand the franchise that took place, or the key event of that year, which many people took it as. The key event was the formation of the Fabian Society, which led to the whole dynamic towards state intervention on a very big scale. Jeremy Corbyn's principles. It's very interesting, you know, since he became Labour leader, he abandoned his positions on the EU, on Trident, on Libya, on austerity. George Osborne abandoned the austerity thing before he changed his position. Principles, I mean, God, I didn't even agree with half his principles, but, you know, the idea that he stuck to them. I very much agree with Jhanelle's points here. You know, one thing that we have to learn from our past experiences is that you can't short-circuit the process of change. You can't do it by manoeuvres, by machinations, by pretending you're in one party and being in another. This sort of degradation of real politics that we see is a sort of political game. You have to start by being straightforward with people, by arguing about clear political positions with people and putting alternative positions forward. The communist disdains to conceal his views, said Karl Marx. I'm very conscious, somebody asked over here, I'm very conscious of my personal experience of political defeat and political failure. But I take counsel from the great Nobel laureate, that's Beckett, not the recent one. Fail again, fail better.
Thank you very much. Can we thank our speakers, please? Excellent. And thank you to the audience for really, really good high-level discussion.